Good afternoon. Welcome to the Yale Center for British Art. I am Mark Aronson, Deputy Director and Chief Conservator here at the museum, and I'm delighted to welcome Sandra Amann to our program today. Sandra is a painting conservator and co-principal of Amann+Estabrook Conservation, which was founded in 1994 with a specialization in the conservation of modern and contemporary paintings and objects of the 20th and 21st centuries. With 6 conservators, the studio is well known for its work with Abstract Expressionist, color field, Minimalist, and pop art, as well as with art from the first half of the 20th century. Close relationships between the studio and leading artists and their estates have helped inform and develop making preservation and treatment strategies. Today's program is titled Material Concerns, Preserving Appearance. Our discussion will focus on the contemporary color field painting presents to painting conservators. Bridget Riley's exhibition, Perceptual Abstraction, is currently on view here at the Center for British Art. And after our conversation, we will be taking questions from the audience. We kindly ask that you wait for someone to bring the microphone to you if you're sitting here in the auditorium, or for those of you in our remote audience, you're welcome to email questions to ycba.programs@yale.edu. After the Q&A, I would like to invite all who are here to view the exhibition on the 3rd and 2nd floors, and encourage those of you in our remote audience to make the trip to New Haven and see the paintings before the last day, which is 24th of July. Today's program is presented through the generosity of the Terry F. Green 1969 Fund for British Art and Culture. Finally, I would like to read Yale's land acknowledgement. Yale University acknowledges that Indigenous peoples and nations, including Mohegan, Mashantucket Pequot, Eastern Pequot, Chattahoochee, Golden Hill Pagusset, Niantic, and the Quinnipiac, and other Algonquin-speaking people have stewarded through generations the lands and waterways of what is now the state of Connecticut. We honor and respect the enduring relationship that exists between these people and nations and this land. It's great to have Sandra here, a friend and a colleague. She's kindly sent pictures of her studio. I think one of the most enjoyable aspects of conservation is to present to the public what's going on behind the scenes. And Sandra works in contemporary. I do not. Generally, I do not. I work on older work, the Paul Mellon collection, which is principally, say, 1650 to 1850. And so our practices are rather different. What has been my involvement with Bridget Riley? Well, as one of the floor conservators when the exhibition came in, I run around working with the registrars and the installations crew, seeing to the paintings on the wall. For this particular exhibition, it was actually really fun. Large paintings came in, paintings that are very fragile, are untouched, and you need to handle them with great care. How do you get a painting from the loading dock to the 2nd floor of our building when it doesn't fit in the elevator or can't be walked up the stairs? And so for me, I have no role in this at all, except I run around during the installation and take pictures when I can, and some of this was just terribly exciting. And here you see the final presentation of Enchant on the wall. I should say most of the photographs I'm presenting today are taken with my phone. This exhibition is presented on linen walls, which are quite warm. Bridget Riley typically has experienced her paintings on white walls, so it's a real treat to see these paintings displayed in a different environment. Sometimes my phone gets the color right, sometimes it doesn't. So, with that preamble, I want to set the first question to Sandra. You worked specifically on contemporary and late 20th century, maybe some early 20th century. What led you to go into that special category of conserving contemporary art?
Well, I started with an internship at the Worcester Art Museum working with the guy who was then head, whose name is Norman Muller. And despite the fact that he was really interested in 14th century Sienese panel paintings, he was incredibly tolerant of the fact that I was much more interested in anything that was in their modern part of the collection. And two things really stand out. One was there was a gorgeous Morris Louis stripe painting, and I think it was the first one that I'd ever seen in person. And I was also asked during the time when I was doing the internship to help install a Sol LeWitt wall drawing. And Sol LeWitt, it was a painter who was sort of included in the minimalist, conceptualist movements and did these amazing installations that were quite arduous, actually. Little tiny sort of notations of how to make marks on the wall that were all done in a set of instructions. So you followed these instructions, and I worked with, this is at the time, with his assistants, and I probably contributed very little, but I found it incredibly exciting. And sort of from there, I started to just gravitate towards finding out more about what people were doing with art of our time, essentially, or art that had come just a little bit before us, and that there was a real field that was burgeoning that was conservation, and it was really conservation of modern works.
What do you think of as differences between someone like myself who works in an old master practice and contemporary? One of the things I think about is often you're the first person to touch something, but you maybe feel differently.
Yes, I do, actually, because I think that that's sometimes, yes, you are the first person that touches something, and so obviously the thing that you really, really want is not to leave a trace of your hand and to make sure that the way that you're intervening is sympathetic to the art and sympathetic to the intent of the artist. I think that with you, it's almost predictable that somebody will have worked on things before, and you probably have whole layers of people working for generations before. So that is a big difference. But somebody working on something that is 20th century, 21st century in an unsympathetic way can do an enormous amount of damage very, very quickly. So I think while there are differences, there's certainly some similarities as well. We're sometimes unpacking things.
Right. You asked that we look at this Robert Rauschenberg, and what are the things that you're unpacking, and why this particular painting?
Well, one of the things that I think really does make a difference between our fields is that I am probably dealing with a wider array of materials. And it's really because artists have a much wider choice of things and are more experimental, perhaps, in what they're going to reach for. But I think of Rauschenberg as being a wonderful example of that, where he sort of is somewhere loosely between object and painting. And in this particular one, I believe there's metal, there's paper, there's certainly multiple kinds of fabric, and some of the paper is printed, some of the paper is not printed. So you have this whole, as he called, combine of materials, and each one of them is going to require a little bit of a different kind of interaction from a conservation point of view as to how you're going to approach it or not approach it. And you want to kind of support these materials, which are probably going to be degrading, without sort of putting your hand in there, and also without making them frozen in a very particular time. I don't want to mark something with my prejudices if I can help it, although I think that we probably do. What do you think about that?
Absolutely. I think when I'm working on an old picture, a Turner, it's not that old. It's not, say, a Renaissance painting. It's maybe 200 years old, not 500 years old. But there's certainly the sense that several hands have been there before me. Maybe I don't like to admit this publicly, but there's more places for me to hide.
Yes.
I have cracks, I have fading, I have blemishes, I have old losses.
Right.
And with these color field paintings, where can you hide your hand, the artifact of your work?
That's a challenge. And I think that that's a challenge with almost anybody that approaches modern or contemporary paintings. You do. You have a whole layer structure, which we may or may not have, but you have some kind of support. You have probably a preparation layer. You have an underdrawing, or you have some kind of a sort of cartoon of some sort, and then you have layers of paint, and then you've got varnish, which we very rarely have.
Very rarely have varnish.
Having varnish would be a really nice thing to have on occasion. So yes, hiding is it's a very difficult thing, and in some cases, you're going to make something slightly better. You're not going to actually make it seamless or perfect or even good, for that matter. And I think that you have to kind of rearrange what your expectations are, and I think you also have to kind of get used to the fact that you have to tolerate that things aren't going to be perfection. And as they age, they're really not going to be perfection. And I think with older works, that tolerance is kind of built in already. And with the works that I'm working on, it's a stepwise education towards the fact that this is not going to be perfection.
Maybe I should point out that we're talking in the framework of paintings, really.
Yes, we are.
Paper and photography, they don't have much place to hide either.
No, they don't. No,
Yeah.
no. I think paper is terrifying, and I think photography even more terrifying, actually.
Right. So to move into some of Bridget Riley, one of the things that we get to do as conservators is we get to touch things.
Yeah.
And so it's a real privilege. It's sometimes scary. Sometimes we put on the gloves and don't want to leave a mark. But what does being allowed to touch a work of art add to the way we understand it? How do conservators add to the conversation? What can we bring to our discussion of Bridget Riley, for instance?
I think we can start to understand why she chooses certain materials or why she left certain materials. And there were certainly instances where she started out with one thing and ended up with another, mostly because it didn't provide the outcome I think that she was trying to achieve. And I think that her goal with materials was very objective oriented. And I think that it was trying to make a consistent field and consistent across the board. In order to achieve that, she morphs from starting very early on with oil and then moving to synthetic house paints. Those seem to have a sort of variety of kind of binders. And then I believe she went then to early acrylics. There were some problems with some of the early acrylics, particularly with some of the whites. And so then she went back to oil. And then I think in the present tense, or in the more present tense, she has worked again with acrylics, but she now only uses, as far as I know, Lascaux acrylic. And she's also done some things where she's gone back to oil, but she's also done very thin layers of oil on top of building up with acrylic. So she's really varied the ingredients quite a bit, but I still think that all of it is to reach her objective. I don't think it's just sort of use of materials like Freud or like Bacon, where the materials really become part of the personality of the painting. This is really trying to have a consistency of vision and make what her vision is, just complete her vision.
You mentioned her use of acrylic and how, as I understand it from the reading that I've done, that acrylic wasn't available in the UK as readily and easily as it was here. So somebody like Roy Lichtenstein was using Magna, one of the early solvent-based acrylics. And Bridget Riley didn't have the range available in the early 60s that American artists might have had.
Probably not, but she did have some early versions of things from what I read, and I don't remember where I read this. But I think that she did part of the thing. There was one that was called Kryla that I think that she used. I think there was something from France that she also used, but I'm not positive about that. So I think that she had some, but also I would imagine that when she came to the States, which was 64, 65, something.
Or even her MoMA.
Was it MoMA? That's right. She would have been exposed to people already using materials here. So I would have thought that that would give her some more choices, but I don't know that for a fact.
Yeah. So when I go around the galleries and I photograph pictures, I try and, I always take the standard frontal shot, but I always try and see things from different angles, see things from an angle that you don't see online for sure or in a book. What is the museum experience? I think the COVID pandemic has kept people out of the museum for a long time. And for those of us in the museum, you start to think about, what are we missing? And one of the things we're missing is a different angle of view.
This is very true.
Does looking at this Bridget Riley at a different angle inform our thinking in a different way?
Yes, it does. I think that you begin to see that despite the fact that I think that consistency was very important to her, that her surfaces aren't actually all that consistent. So that you have a lot more variation in terms of what the paint is actually doing and how you're going to see that. I think it also gives you a sense of how disturbing any kind of mark, even subtle, could be on this surface. And I think that anything that kind of undermines that can become a really kind of a destructive factor in these paintings. And I think there are other people that kind of joined in that group, particularly after the mid-20th century. I mean, I think that Agnes Martin is a good example of, you have a big soil deposit on an Agnes Martin. Now that might not be a very big deal on a Turner, for instance, but on an Agnes Martin, that's a big deal. And you're suddenly adding almost a design element to something that so clearly does not want that. And somebody like Mark Rothko is somewhat similar, although obviously wildly different in terms of form. But if you start to undermine those sort of shimmering fields of color with an abrasion or with some kind of thing that becomes almost compositional in its addition, I think that you realize how fragile these are and how fragile having surfaces that are minimal in terms of damage, how much of a big deal that becomes. I mean, I have one more thing that I would sort of like to add here, is that one of the things that I think about the fact that we get to play with paintings and really get a sense of what is the artist doing, or at least trying to get a sense of what is the artist doing, and that this is this physical object in front of us, and how important it is for people to understand that it's not just sort of a concept. I think that if we can communicate that as conservators to those of us who are around, to collectors, to curators, to anybody that you're working with, I think that that makes everybody else a much better partner in terms of making treatment decisions, especially about these things that are so wildly sensitive. So I'm very encouraging of trying to bring people in and sort of get them to see things the way that we see things. And okay, they're not going to spend the stuff they're spending their life doing, but if they can get some kind of glimpse of that and how fun it is to look at things like that, I think that that could be a tremendous help.
In your practice, you've worked with a certain number of contemporary artists, but do you make your own art? Does that figure into your thinking and your practice?
Yes and no. How's that? I mean, certainly early on, I've always been interested in materials. So even as a kid, I kind of played around with all sorts of different things, including even those beads that you put in molds and put them in the oven and made fake stained glass. So I'd said that from the good, the bad, to the indifferent. And certainly when I was in school, I was both an art history and studio major. So yes, I did quite a bit of painting and drawing and anything else that I could sort of fit in there. Not so much after school, a little bit, but I have sort of created this hole that I've dug myself into where I make presents that are really elaborate for my niece and nephew, and sort of try and incorporate something that's going on in their lives with the present they make. So I sort of feel like I keep my hand in a little bit. And in the present tense, I do lots of embroidery, which I learned from my grandmother.
So handwork.
Very much so, yeah. And when it's really going well, I feel like it's sort of painting with thread, and when it's really not going well, I'm not quite sure what to say about it. But in terms of having an interest in materials and having a long-term interest in materials, I really find that that has informed how I use materials and how I understand the use of materials. And I think that it's very good to look at what other people are doing. It's also very important, I think, to have the tactile sense of like, so what can I do with that? Not just what they can do with that, but what can I do with that? And how does that feel to do something?
And does it ever get to, oh, I think I understand what they were doing?
Occasionally.
Occasionally.
Not as often as I'd like.
One of the things I think when this question about touching is we get to look at the back.
Yeah.
And so we chose this one. It's actually kind of revealing. It's a replica by Bridget Riley, artist replica of a 1962 canvas that was destroyed. And this one is Riley, 1965.
Right.
Black and white discs. So Riley recreated her paintings when she needed to, and there are several in the exhibition that are recreations by the artist or by the artist studio. She's somebody, we talk about handwork, she's somebody who's using the hands of studio assistants.
Yeah.
What has been your practice? Do you get involved with recreating works of art? You have direct relationships with some contemporary painters. Saul LeWitt was somebody who felt, yeah, here's the instructions.
Go for it.
Go for it. There's a foundation and a archives that provides both quality control and technical know-how. Would you recreate a Bridget Riley?
No.
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 What's the difference?
I think that in my personal world, I am happy to be assistant to, supportive of an artist and what they're trying to do, but I'm not interested in being the extended hand of the artist. And I think that recreating somebody's work is just that, and I don't think that's my role, and I guess I don't really think that that's the conservator's role. I think an artist has every right to do that, should they wish to do that. I think it's incredibly complicated, and I think that once they are no longer amongst us, it will become even more complicated as to what that means and what that doesn't mean. And I think, and Bridget Riley certainly is an example, but there are lots of other examples as well. And I think that it's really murky territory, and I don't know how you weigh an artist having said, this is fine, go ahead and do that. And I don't mean Saul LeWitt, where that's really part of the plan, that's part of the actual object. But with somebody like Riley, so is there a difference between what she first produced and what was later produced, even if it's considered to be the same thing? And I think that gets into all kinds of different things. I think when somebody goes backwards, you're not bringing the same thing to the table anymore. You've progressed, you've moved on to other things. So the hands are going to be different, the materials may be different, the way of thinking about it is different. So aren't you sort of freezing something already in a kind of false way, because you're not really doing it, you're making something static. So it just, I don't know how that sort of plays out over a long period of time.
So as I said, we get to look at the back, and on the back, there's amazing documentation both about what the material was, what kind of paint, and the size, which is really funny to me, because when you see these paintings that are 90 3/4 inches, or 90 3/4 inches when they were made, but now they might be something else. And if it came into the collection, we would measure it and say, well, no, it's not 90 1/4 inches at all. It's 90 1/2 now. But Riley wrote that perception is the medium.
Yeah.
And what do you make of that statement in lieu of all this detail on the back that says acrylic on linen, PVA emulsion on linen, emulsion on wood, oil on linen? What is it telling us?
I think it's telling us fact. I'm not sure it's telling us much more than that. I think that she was very dogmatic about achieving her end with whatever means what was going to be necessary. And if that means that you're going to switch from a different material because it is more effective or it is more efficient in achieving that goal, I think that she's going to do that. I actually think that the whole thing about visual consistency is so much more important than the materials that she was using. So I think it's like, I interpret that as the way that we perceive it is indeed what the medium is, because that is what is in front of us. So I don't think that it was media dependent in the sense of like, let me experiment with this because it's going to give me something new. It's like, let me use this because I want it to achieve my end.
Okay.
Here are just a few examples. If you go back, the first one, the black and white one, this is when she's using probably some kind of an emulsion paint, probably a house paint, although I wouldn't swear to it. And here she's using a solid support, and it was generally a hardboard or something masonite-like that was on either side with a wooden slat border and in between bordering it and nailed in from the front. So, and then she moved to her next sort of phase, which was going more towards canvas. And here as you can see, she's going from black and white, and now she's sort of introducing this gray and sort of slightly more tonal quality to her paintings. And this probably is acrylic, right?
Synthetic emulsion on canvas.
Okay. Well, yeah. So it should be. Yeah, it should be.
One of the things I know, just going back here, is that on the panels, on the paintings on board, she's approaching it technically correct. Whatever you do on the front, you do on the back. So
right.
That is going to provide the object the most stability going forward in time. And so that's something I think we all learn in conservation school and in some art schools, that if you're going to paint the front, if you don't want it to warp, paint the back.
Paint the back.
So there's a educated approach to the use of materials here.
Yeah, I think that there was, but I think also that her training is actually somewhat classical in the sense that, for instance, her early work was all with drawing, and she really wanted to get a command of drawing and what she could do with that before she moved forward to painting. So, and actually that's sort of relevant as going back to this one, this is, I have no idea, 65. So by the sort of later part, I think, 60s or early 70s, it's a little bit hard to actually pinpoint the date, or it was for me anyway. She's doing incredibly meticulous and worked out preparatory drawings and gouache studies. And as one of her assistants said, continually open to modification. That's a quote. And then her studio assistants actually were the ones who took these preparatory drawings and transferred them into them being a painting. So she would do, as far as I understand, she would do drawings that were actually the same scale as the painting, which the feat of that to me is remarkable. I'm not sure how you do that. But working big with gouache, for instance, that is really hard. And we have somewhere we have a really lovely slide of one of her working drawings. Do we know where that is? Yeah, there. And you can kind of see that, and I don't know if this is a complete working drawing or if this is just part of one. I would kind of think that it's part of one, but I'm not really sure. But you can see how much effort there is already just in this, which probably is something of a fragment.
Right.
A same assistant also said in relation to her use of materials was all the mediums were chosen as the best technical means available to achieve a certain visual result. In the earliest works, the need was for flat, matte, uninflected surface. And this has remained important, although the need for intensity of color has become increasingly vital. And I think that really sums it up very succinctly.
In this comparison, I think we chose sort of what is the difference between acrylic and then full-bodied oil, where the hue and saturation becomes
such an important factor.
Such an important factor, whereas in the acrylic, it's
kind of muted.
It's muted, and when we were walking around the exhibit this morning, and you stand in some of these paintings, and you actually lose yourself in that muted color
quality.
Feel.
Yeah.
The very intense paintings.
Your eye tends to just immediately focuses and then starts to bounce around. It's kind of like two different ways of seeing it, actually, or it was for me. One of the other things that I thought was really interesting about her use of materials, and this is a little bit off of that, but is that she was very interested in not having the artist hand be an active part of the surface. But on the other hand, she didn't disallow the pencil marks that she used to, or that the assistants used to transfer the design and to sort of have the placement laid out for the painting. So you see them on lots of paintings, not all of them, but you see them on a lot. You also see that there's a very soft ridge at the edges of the forms, and it's because she did not allow the use of a masking material.
Right.
They would do this with a ruling pen, which I don't know if you've ever used, but those are hard things to control. And to do them over a long swath like that, that's a skill. So there's a funny contradiction between not wanting the human element to sort of enter into it and yet saying that this is fine. And, you know, she was very concerned with having the surface even in terms of sheen so that your eye isn't interrupted. And yet with the one that we just showed before, with the color one, the one that would be on the right, your eye bounces around partially because the saturate and the sheen are quite different depending on the passage. And apparently, as long as it was still within what she considered to be her vision, that was perfectly acceptable. So, and you kind of spin that out even more on the early paintings, which are the panel paintings. The nails start to protrude a little bit over time. And you'd think that, oh my God, this is an interruption. But no, it's an interruption if the paint has fallen off the head of the nail, in which case it should be replaced.
We have some pictures coming up of that.
Yeah, and it's just fascinating, I think, all of the different things that don't make this linear.
I think maybe another difference between, say, a contemporary painter, artist, and an older one. Riley wrote prolifically. Often we're working on paintings where we have nothing written by the artist. What does her writing do to inform your either understanding of the paintings or the treatment of them? Oh, here are those.
Here are the nail heads. Yes.
I'm sorry.
That's okay.
I was expecting a different slide. So there are those nail heads, and what you're saying is those are not.
That's not considered. That's just an artifact of its making, and that's fine. And here, the cracks just from the grain of the wood below, one would think that that would be an interruption, but no, those are also fine and just sort of a natural event. Oh, and yeah, this one is sort of a cool one. If you look at the sort of close-up of the inner circle, there are those little soft divots or indentations. Those were markers for where you place the lines. And again, it's such a clear indication that there's a human being who's making those marks, and yet that's considered perfectly fine and part of the work. So there's a little inconsistency here, which makes it all the more interesting.
Yeah, for me, when you do the reading, when you look at the literature, when you look at the books, when you look at the online catalog, there's a lot of emphasis made on having sanded this surface, having gotten things perfectly flat, and the graphic sense of the work, and certainly printed in a catalog. It's all about
graphics.
And you lose this.
Yeah.
And of course, as conservators, we're looking for this.
Yes, and this is, to me, this is the fun.
Okay, I have to make a confession. I took a raking light. This is not evenly lit the way Dylan, our lighting person, lit the painting. This is me going in there with a bright light from one side, looking for this stuff. But for me, when I look at these things, no, these are not flat. These are very textured objects.
Yeah, and even some of the later ones that we saw upstairs, they were quite textured, and there was quite a differentiation just in terms of the sort of brushwork, which I thought was kind of interesting, and I didn't pick that up in the catalog at all, I have to say. This is very interesting. We have a close-up of this one, I think, and here you can really, I hope that this, you can really see it up there. This is, again, speaking to her process and how she made these ovals sort of evolve as she wanted them to. And apparently she first put a piece of tape marking the orientation of the ovals, because as you can see, they kind of move from one direction to another. Then she would put the pencil line indicating where the oval should be placed. Then she would paint the oval. Then she'd remove the tape, and then she'd paint it again. So you get this very clear and kind of wonderful marking of exactly the order which she did things. And I just think that's great.
Yeah. This one's funny. You can see where the tape, there are a couple of them where the tape actually
Didn't come off quite as
Or the
well
oval
as perhaps.
missed the tape,
Yeah,
or the
exactly.
tape missed the oval.
Yeah.
There's a very cute story when we walked through in a Zoom visit with Bridget Riley through the show just before we opened. We went up close with our laptop to show her these marks, and she commented, "Oh, it needs another coat of paint." That the tape marks, she would rather see less of them, I guess.
Right. Yeah. I can understand that.
This is the question that I was slightly out of order, but the question about Riley as a prolific writer, and how does that inform your understanding or your treatment of Riley when you're working on one?
I mean, she certainly wrote a lot, and she wrote relatively clearly about her own work and how she was thinking about her work. I have to say that my takeaway is that she had a very, very specific vision of her work, and I'm not sure that I understand entirely what that is. So therefore, my response would be to do as little as possible and intervene as little as possible, and try and think the way that she does, if I can, that at certain point it becomes, whatever the damage is, becomes too much of its own thing and interferes with the continuity of the work, and then one should consider doing some kind of intervention. But unless that happens, that probably staying back as much as possible is a good idea. The problem with me is that, so where's that line? And I think she has a very clear idea of what that line is, and I think that's a very hard thing to communicate and not have it become totally subjective. So I think it's a very difficult thing, but I think it's a difficult thing with anybody who has a sort of minimal kind of surface of when do you step in.
What about the relationship to older painters? We spoke specifically about Matisse.
Yeah, that she really thought about other painters a lot, and I think that she felt influenced throughout her career and continues to be very connected to both Seurat and to Matisse, and I think Mondrian, and also I think that she was a big fan of Pollock. So there were lots of people that she, I think, really felt were kind of part of her thinking and part of the way that she looked at art and looked at her own art. And so I think the one thing that I did sort of take away from the reading that I've been doing is that she is very consistent about having these people close to her and about continuing to think about them throughout her career.
She was very active in the National Gallery in London, instrumental in the designing of or the talking about the Sainsbury wing. Clearly somebody who knew the traditions of European painting.
Absolutely, yeah. I think very aware.
I think we have more slides than we have time for, but we had discussed a little bit more about the back and what things tell us. And you had commented about the difference between this calligraphic script on some of the paintings and a more blocky handwriting on another.
From what I understand, the one that would be on the right is early enough that it was the artist still doing the execution of the painting, and that most likely is her hand. And as it became more and more the assistants doing the painting, they became sort of a slightly mannered, more stylized kind of script that was used. And I have to say that there's so much information on these things that I kind of thought, is there some other significance to this beside the fact that there's a marking of information? And from what I understand, the answer is no. The signature is really sort of a sign of completion, almost like a stamp, and that the materials that are written on the back are to transfer information. And it's a very sort of cut and somewhat dried situation. And that I have heard rumor that the markings on the side edge are so that if they're stored with only their side available, you can see what it is readily. I don't know if that's actually true or not.
This is something that when we take the show down, I want to spend a bit more time looking at the different canvases and which ones are primed and which ones are not primed. I tend to think that the ones that are on raw canvas are the acrylics, and most of the ones that are on what looks like a store-bought, a pre-primed fabric, are the oils. But I want to spend more time looking at more of them when we take them off the wall.
I think that would be really fun.
taking them off the wall, you just see these amazing, sometimes the back of a painting ends up looking like an old-fashioned steamer trunk.
It does really, yeah. No, I mean, it really gives an indication of how many shows she's been in. I mean, it's kind of breathtaking, actually. She's had a remarkable career. So, you know, that really tells the story.
Here, more of those marks.
Yep.
The nails coming forward. And just a couple more pictures, this idea of...
Here you can really see that the sheen is a little bit inconsistent, but how wonderfully saturated those colors are. And I think that was the overlying interest, and the sheen sort of takes second place there.
So I think, just ending with a picture I've recently worked on, and then one of the Bridget Rileys in the exhibition upstairs. That was really fun to talk, and I think we can open up to the audience for any questions that anybody in the lecture hall or in the Zoomosphere has. Julian.
No questions in the Zoomosphere yet, so I'll let the audience.
I have a question for you, Sandra. Have you found yourself in a situation where you're treating up paintings by a living artist who you might be in contact with, and you felt compelled to, if not advise them, but to comment on something their materials or their use of materials are doing because you can anticipate a problem coming down the line? Or is that one of those situations where you feel it oversteps?
I think it would depend on my relationship, to be honest with you. And I think that if we had a kind of more fluid relationship, I might. But I also think that as a conservator, and particularly in the end of the field that I'm in, is that our role is to try and figure those things out and be helpful after the fact. But I don't really want to step in and say, you know, you really shouldn't be doing that. Because I don't think that that should be the role of the conservator. If somebody asks me, and there are frequently cases where somebody calls up and says, you know, I am trying desperately to make these two things work, and I can't figure out why they're not. And if I can figure it out, or help in some way, or say, like, what, I maybe go in that direction a little bit, that's different. But the sort of shaking the finger, I'm kind of reluctant to go there.
Thank you very much. It's exciting.
Can I ask a follow-up to that? Do you get to know the living artist?
In some cases, yes. We certainly have worked with a number of them. For instance, we've done some more advising than anything else with Adam Pendleton's studio recently, and that was really fascinating because his use of materials is pretty remarkable, and the range of materials is pretty great. We've also done a little bit of work with Julie Moretu's studio, and that's also been kind of fun, and Jenny Holter, and so there've been, and then sadly, we've worked with a lot of people who now no longer are with us, like Robert Ryman and Chuck Close and Tom Wesselman and Elizabeth Murray, to just sort of name a few, where they had particular things they wanted us to do, and it was really fun to sort of get to know them from that vantage point.
Did you provide an archive for them? In a sense, Bridget Riley is creating her own archive on the back of her paintings. When you're advising a living artist, or do you pay attention to whether the advice becomes part of the record or not?
I mean, I think that we always encourage people to say what they are actually doing. Whether or not they do or not, I have no idea. How's that? I mean, I think that people are much better now about doing artist interviews, and when, for instance, when something is incoming into an institution, normally I think now the artist is interviewed as to what they're using. Whether or not that is really an accurate record, and I don't mean that as a reflection of their withholding or not telling you, but whether or not they actually remember exactly what they were using, I think is probably maybe not.
What about your relationship to other conservators? Do people call you and say, hey, have you worked on Bridget Riley, and can you?
Yeah.
Does that happen a lot, a little?
Happens a lot, and I think that's great. There's a nice kind of interaction between people who are working. And they're also, I hate to say this, but my end of the field is not that big, so you generally know quite a number of people. I mean, one of the things that was great is that there's a conservator in London whose name is Philip Young, who I had several conversations with, and he was incredibly generous and helpful. He's worked with Bridget Riley for years, and that he had things to say that I would not have known had I not had those conversations. So that was particularly fun.
I believe there was another question here.
May I ask 2 questions? So my first one is, considering the precision behind these paintings, do you think she had any reservations when it came to utilizing assistants?
No, I don't actually. I think in a way that she was making a switch from it being personalized with her doing it to it being a little bit more distanced with assistants doing it. But I think that the fact that she does such finished drawings, if it's not physically her hand, it is still her hand. So I'm not sure, I don't know if that quite answers your question.
Yeah, it does.
Okay.
For me, it's so interesting, the difference between contemporary, say, Sol LeWitt and Bridget Riley, and this issue of hand, and she doesn't want the hand to be a part of it. She doesn't want painting to be stylized.
Right.
Is, I think, one of her words.
Yes, it is, yeah.
And yet, there's still the maintaining control, choosing the assistant's hand.
And training them to do it in the manner that you want it to be done.
And with Sol LeWitt, you know, if you go up to Mass MoCA and you see the vast installation of his wall drawings, they were overseen by probably John Hogan, the archivist. But then armies of students did the handwork. And it's more of a,
They were probably just as thrilled
here's
as I
the
was.
instructions, and here's the material, but there's also, you can also interpret it. You know, bear down really hard, or bear down medium hard. And so you have one student has one kind of medium hard and one student has another.
Mm-hmm.
I get the sense with Bridget Riley that there's not so much leeway.
I think the tolerance is less. That's my guess anyway.
You have a second question? Yeah. You already talked about how she took advantage of the difference between oil and acrylic in regards to like the vibrancy. But do you know if she took advantage or was even hindered by the fact that oil takes longer to dry?
I'm sure she would have been hindered by that, yeah. On the other hand, these are not wildly built up surfaces. So I'm not sure that, I don't know, that'd be a great question to ask her actually. The one thing that I have heard is, and again, I'm not completely sure about this, is that on the ones where she put oil on top of acrylic, she's really using an incredibly thin layer. And maybe that is in response to what you're asking. That it was a way of having a surface, but you could get that final depth of color at the very end instead of having to build it up with layers of oil.
Other questions? Yes, I see a hand.
Thank you for the fascinating presentation. I just have 2 questions. As conservator, is there any documentation that you would do after you finish the work? And then
we do documentation before we do anything. So generally, for instance, when a painting arrives, it's immediately photographed, and we sort of take our in-house notes on it to sort of document like what it is that we think the condition issues are. And then there's usually a proposal offered to like, these are the things that we're thinking of addressing, or like, do you have, usually it's more of a conversation actually to begin with. What are your concerns? And okay, those are your concerns. And we found these too. And is this something that you want addressed? Or if there's something that you didn't realize was unstable, that's something we'd probably advocate for. We won't really advocate for pretty much anything else, but that one we will. And then whatever approval is given and you go ahead with the work. And then we write up a treatment report saying what we have done and what materials we've used. And we live in this extreme hope that this will follow the painting around in its life, but I'm not sure how much that actually happens. And we also document it again with photographs after we're done with it. But I think that the real nugget of information is the written thing of what you've done, because that really gives somebody a lot of information to inform them with the next treatment, because you have to always sort of think, there will be a next treatment, most likely. It would be really nice for them to know that we tried this and this worked, and we tried this and this didn't work, or that this is what's on the painting and this is what's not on the painting.
Thank you. And the second question.
You had a second question.
Yeah, I do. The second question is that previously you mentioned that sometimes our work nowadays might have multiple material. So how do you handle that? So for example, you said one of the artwork might have textile and metal. So how true do you have to be to conserve?
I'm not
using the material. So if it's a piece of metal, do you have to find exactly the same thing or something very similar? Or, you know,
if there was a loss or a hole in the metal.
Right.
Possibly, if it interfered with it visually, but I think those are all things for discussion, because it's sort of, there's shades of gray here. And if there's a loss to the metal, but in truth it doesn't really disrupt anything, probably we would leave it alone. Our tendency is to leave as much alone as we possibly can. So I think it's all going to be a matter of sort of balance, and if the artist is around, including them in the conversation as to what they think may or may not be significant, and also the person who's responsible for the work. I mean, either the agent, owner, or curator, whatever, whoever is the person that actually has the physical object.
One of the things, one of our guiding principles is to follow the idea of reversibility, that whatever we do, the next person, if they need to undo it, it's easy to do that. So sometimes we would use a material that is not like the original.
Or it might just look like the original.
Because it will be easier to remove. I'm thinking more in terms of paints. We don't restore an oil painting with oil paint.
Right.
We use some pigments ground in varnish or
watercolor for that.
Or watercolor or acrylic. Because I know the next person, my work is going to have a different aging cycle than the original. So I want the next person to be able to remove my work. So we might not use the same kind of metal, the same kind of glue. We might use something completely different. A follow-up to your first question, do you find it's working with, say you have an artist who brings you a damaged work of their own and they want help with, versus a private client? Is the relationship the same, or do you find artists are more strict, more lenient, private clients want everything looking perfect?
I think artists are this is a gross generalization. I would say generally more lenient, as long as what you're going to end up with fits into what their idea of the painting is. So I think it's extremely variable more than anything else. But I think they're not as worried about perfection, or generally not as worried about perfection, but it's still within a sort of narrow confine. Does that make any sense?
I think Martina, yeah.
Thank you so much. This was fascinating. I work here, so I was here for the installation, and I've looked at these paintings very, very closely. When you see them in reproduction, they look almost mechanical, and then when you see them in the galleries, they look like paintings. But you've shown pictures here that I'm going to go upstairs and see if I can see what you've shown. This has been a very sort of warts and all kind of a talk. And I just wondered...
But that's also, as conservators, that's what we're fascinated with, I hate to say.
Of course, yeah, no, it's fascinating. And I enjoyed seeing your Raking Light pictures, Mark, where, you've kind of revealed a whole other aspect of these pictures. But I wondered, Sandra, in your experience, how do artists feel about having these imperfections kind of made visible? Is that something that people are generally resistant to? Sort of having people look very closely and examine the flaws in a sort of public setting?
I think that there's a range there. And I think there are some people that are very sensitive. I know of at least one artist that I can think of who did not like his work to be looked at under IR, because you could see some of the underlying layers, and that to him wasn't what the art was. The art was what about you saw on the surface and the buildup of that surface, but not what the actual layers were. And he had a very strong reaction to somebody trying to sort of unpack what had been there. So I think that's really, it varies from artist to artist. I don't think that there's any, I don't think I can make any broad sweeping generalization about that. But I think some artists are really interested in what their process is, and I would think that then somebody else looking at it would be sort of compatible with that. And then there are others where you're presenting something that's finished, and it's their process. It's not yours necessarily to sort of investigate. And I would think that's a completely different attitude.
Hey, Sandra, it's 1:02. And I can't thank you enough for coming and joining the conversation, looking at Bridget Riley with me.
I can't thank you enough for having the conversation.
Okay. And thanks very much to the audience today, and also for the people that are in the Zoomosphere. Please do try and come if you're in striking distance of New Haven before the exhibition closes, last day, 24th of July.